Good morning, guys. Am I audible to all of you?
Good morning.
Yes, good morning.
And my
Yes, good
screen
morning.
is also visible to all of you, right?
Yes, right.
Perfect. Yes.
Yes. So today, basically, we are going to cover three important concepts. One is what is all about DbContext class in Entity Framework Database First Approach. Then we will discuss what exactly the DbSet, right? Then we will discuss what are the different types of relationships that you can manage in database and how those relationships are going to be managed by the entity framework in our .NET application, right? And these three things we are going to cover today. And from tomorrow, we are going to start the actual development, right? So CRUD operation is not a difficult one, right? CRUD operation, if you look, we have already covered, but again, I will show you CRUD operation. But most of the time, CRUD operation means insert of the delete is not that difficult, right? But whenever you are fetching the data by your requirement, by joining the tables, right, for performing different kind of operations, right, that things are going to be a little difficult, and we will focus more on those things rather than doing this insert, update, and delete operation. Yes, going further, I'm also going to cover how you can perform the bulk insert, update, delete operations, right? How you can improve the performance of your bulk operations. Those things are also going to be covered. How you can do these things in a connected environment, how you can do these things in a disconnected environment, how you are going to load the entities by implementing lazy loading, by implementing eager loading, right? Everything we are going to cover, right? So today, basically, you can consider the theoretical concept is going to be complete today. And from next session, right, we are going to start the actual entity framework development tasks, right? So as of now, what we are discussing for the understanding purpose, right? So most of the things are developed by entity framework. What are these things? How entity framework using this thing? These are the things which we are going to discuss, right? Because see, if entity framework developing some code, then we should know what exactly those codes are all about, right? So today we are going to discuss DbContext class, right? So according to MSDN, what MSDN saying, right? If you want to see, right, copy hyperlink, go to the website, right? What MSDN saying? Let's have a look. So according to MSDN, a DbContext instance represents a combination of a unit of work and the repository pattern, right? So what is unit of work? What is repository patterns? We'll discuss in detail, such that it can be used to query from a database. So whenever I'm saying query from a database means it's a select query. So from the database, you can use, if you want to select some data, right? Then for that purpose, you need to use a select query. So this DbContext class allows us to execute some select query in a database and retrieve the result and group together changes, right? Group together changes means here unit of work will come into the picture. That means if you want, then you can also perform the insert, update, delete operations as a unit, right? You can perform insert, update, delete operation as a unit, which will update the data in the database. So back to store as a unit. Store means your database. So it will be store those things, right, as a unit in the database, right? DB context is conceptually similar to object context, right? So this is the definition which is provided by Microsoft, right? So in simple words, we can say that DbContext instance is the primary class that is responsible for interacting with the database and performing the database CRUD operation. So you can perform the insert, after delete operation as well as you can perform the select operations. Clear what is the meaning or what is the definition? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so whenever we use entity framework database first approach to interact with an existing database, the entity data model creates a context class. So what is entity data model? If you remember, right, suppose if I'm going to create a new console application, right, then while I'm creating the new console application, if I want to work with the entity framework, right, then first of all, what I need to do? I need to add an entity data model or not, right? Suppose I'm developing one console application, right? So in this case, while you are going to work with the entity data model, whenever you are going to use entity framework, you need to add an entity data model, right? So add new item, and if you go to the data section, there is something called entity data model. It doesn't matter whether you are going with a code first approach, model first approach, database first approach, right? Entity framework data model should be there, right? So So whenever we use entity framework database first approach to interact with existing database, the EDM. So whenever I'm saying EDM means entity data model. What is entity data model? This one. This one we are going to add first. And in this entity data model, we need to provide the information to the entity framework, that what is the database, what are the tables, whatever the storage procedure that we want to use, right? Every information we need to provide to this EDM, right? The entity data model create the context class, which is inherited from the system.entity.dbContext class. So this entity data model, what I'm showing here, it will create your context class, and that context class is going to be inherited from the system.data.entity.dbContext class. If you go to the definition of this dbContext class, then you will see that this is a class which complete signature is system.data.entity.dbContext, right? So you can see this is the name system.data.entity.dbContext class. So entity framework by default create a class, right? That context class by default is going to inherit from this system.data.entity.dbContext class. You can see this is the context class which is created by entity framework. We are not creating this context class. This context class is created by the entity data model, right? And this context class is inherited from this class, right? Every entity data model generate one context class for the database, right? So in order to verify this, expand the EDMX file in the solution explorer and open EDM name.context.tt file, right? So if you want to see, right, if you want to see where the context file is, where the context file, right, or where the I mean the entity data model where created this context file, if you want to see, then you will expand your project solution explorer, then you have to open the edm name.context.cs. So what is the entity data model name you provided while you are creating your application, right? Go to the first document where we created this one, right? So if you go and expand the documentation, right, then you will see while creating the entity data model, right, what name we have provided. What name we have provided to our entity data model? Student data model, right? Then what he will do, he will create a file with the name EDM name, that is nothing but your student data model, then a context.tt. So is there any file within your EDMX file which name is student data model.context.tt? Yes. So if you go and check your application project which we have created, say in this case, right? In this case, the student data model is nothing but your name of the entity data model. Then it is appending the context and then it is appending the TT file, right? So in this case, you can see the name is student data model dot context dot TT file, right? So in this case, you will see student data model dot context dot TT file. And inside this TT file, right, you will find the context class as shown in the below image, right? So in this case, you can see within your context file, you will find the within your TT file, you will find the context file. Again, the context class file name is going to be your entity data model dot context dot cs, right? So in this case, if you go, so this in this two file, right, the first name what should be the name entity framework will use? This is nothing but your entity data model name. As you are providing the entity data model as student data model, it will create the context file as student data model dot context dot tt, and then it will create student data model dot context dot cs. So this is our context file. So what is this tt file? Why this tt file is there? Right? Let us try to observe this thing indeed. So the tt file, right? It's a template file, and this template file is a T4 template file, right? And this template file basically used to generate a context class. In this case, the context class file name is this one. And whenever we change anything in the entity data model, then again this T4 template is going to update the context file. What it means? It means this is the context file. This is our ADMX file, right? And whenever we are editing something in the entity model, if I'm deleting some model, right, deleting for some entity in the EDMX file, if I'm adding some new entities to this EDMX file, right, whenever I'm doing some kind of changes to my entity data model, right, those changes needs to be take effects in the context file, right? So suppose that means what? Whenever we are creating the entity, then those entities are going to be added as a DbSet of a T entity type in the context class, right? So that means if I'm removing, then that should be removed from the context class. If I'm adding a new entity, then that should be added into the context class. That means whenever we are doing any changes into our ADMX file, those changes are also going to be updated in the context file. And who is going to do these changes? The TT file, right? So this is what I'm mentioning here. Whenever we change the entity data model, that is the ADMX file, the T4 template is going to update the context class. You can see the context class file right now. If you want to check, if you want to see what exactly the context file looks like, then what you need to do, you need to open this student data model.context.tt. Within this TT file, you will find this ADMX name.context.cs class file, right? So guys, here you need to remember two things, right? So here you need to remember two things in the sense. So the context class file name is your entity data model dot context dot cs. But within this is your class file. This is your CS class file. Within this CS class file, your class is going to be reside. Your context class is going to be reside. Don't think that this is your context class. This is your context class file. File means it's a physical object .cs. And within this context class, you will find your context. Within this context file, you will find your context class. So the name for your context file is entity data model dot context dot cs. So entity data model name, what is entity data model? Student data model, and then context dot cs. But what is your what is your context class name? Context class name is nothing but your database name, right? This is nothing but your database name, appending the entities and inheriting from the DB context, right? So this is nothing but your database name, appending entities and inheriting from the DbContext class, right? So the default context class name is database name, appending entities, right? For example, this is EFDemoDB entities, and it is derived from the DbContext class. Clear? What naming convention is followed by Entity Framework for creating the TT file, for creating the context file, and for creating the context class?
Yes.
Right? So this class is derived from the system.data.entity.dbContext class, and it is a context class. And as you can see, this context class contains one constructor, right? And what is the role of this constructor? Now, this constructor will call the DbContext class parameterized constructor, and while the calling parameterized constructor, it needs to provide the database name or the connection string for where it needs to interact, right? Where it needs to go and perform the database CRUD operation. And here we are providing the connection string. So name equals to EFDemoDB entities means this is nothing but your connection string. If you go and check your app config file, then you will find the connection string. And what is the name? EFDemoDB entities. So here I'm providing the connection string. So this is one of the member or one of the property you can say of this context class. Then other things are the properties of a DbSet of type entity for each database table and view, right? Then what you will see? You will see few properties. What exactly this properties means? Now, how many number of entities are there, right? For each database table and view, it will include those as a DbSet of T entity type property. So in this case, course, standard, student, student address, teacher, these are one database table. View student course. This is your view, right? For each database table and for each database view, it will add those as DbSet of a T entity property, DbSet of a T entity type. So in this case, this is so once you add your model classes, right? As once entity framework add the model classes, right? As a DbSet of a T entity type, then that will be considered as a entity. And whenever you access these courses, right, then it will check what is the type. The type is course. So this course is mapped with which database table. The mapping information is already provided in our CS mapping, right? You already know where the mapping information is provided, right? And based on the table mapping, right, so you will able to know this course entity is mapped with this particular database table. Okay, then I have to communicate with that particular table whether the so then it will check what kind of operation you are performing, whether you are adding some new element, right, adding some new entity, or you are updating something, or you are deleting something, or you are pouring something, right? Based on that operation, right, it is going to generate the appropriate SQL statement, right? If you are simply retrieving the data from the courses, right, then it is going to generate the select SQL statement. If you are adding a new entity, then it is going to generate the insert SQL statement. Updating, it is going to generate the update, and for deleting, it is going to generate the delete SQL statement over the database table, which is mapped with this course entity, right? And this is on model creating. We'll discuss these things in detail, right? When we are going to interact with the code fast approach, right? And then for each database, you can say each database storage procedure and a function, it will create them as a method, right? So this is what the entity framework of the context class looks like. It should have a constructor which should have called the parameterized constructor. It should have model on model creating. This method is not required in this case, right? And then it will include each database table and views as DbSet of T entity type, and then it should have this thing, right? This thing in the sense for each storage procedure, and you can say for each database table value function, right? It will create .NET function, simple as it is. Clear, guys? What are the things the entity, the context class is going to contain,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Then what are the responsibility and what are the things, right? The DbContext class is going to perform. The DbContext class is an important class, as we already discussed. It is primary responsibility for interacting with the database and performing the database CRUD operation, right? Not only it is performing the database CRUD operation, right? Later, I will also show you how it is going to execute the storage procedure and the table value functions. Give me 1 minute, guys. Right? So what is the primary responsibility of a DbContext class? As we discussed, it is basically going to perform the database operations, right? So while it is going to perform the database operation, sometimes it is going to generate the insert, update, delete, and select statement. And it is also possible that using this DbContext class, we can also execute the storage procedures and table valued functions. Storage procedures and table valued functions, right? That means what? That means it acts as a bridge between your domain classes or entity classes right? So in that case, what will happen? As a .NET developer, you are going to work with domain classes, or you can say entity classes. Then there is something called a database in the backend, and the DbContext class will act as a bridge between our domain classes and the database, and perform the different kind of operations, right? So it acts as a bridge between your domain classes or entity classes and the underlying database, right? So what are the things it is going to perform? Database connection, right? So as a developer, right, as a developer, we need not to be worried about how the connection is established with the database, when the connection is going to be established with the database, when the connection is going to be closed with the database, right? So everything is going to be managed by the DbContext class automatically. Coring means what? Now, if you want to fetch some data from the database, right, behind the scene, it is going to generate the select query for us. Change tracking means what? Once you fetch the data from the database, then it will keep track on the context object. It will keep track on the entities, right? Whether the entity is in unchanged state or what, whether the entity is modified or what, whether the entity is inserted state or what, whether the entity is deleted state or what, right? And those things are going to be tracked by the DbContext class. But guys, remember, once one entity move to once one entity move to detached state, right, then it is not going to track that entity. Persisting data, right? Persisting data in the sense what? Now, using this DbContext class, we can also update the database. Update the database in the sense we can insert some new data into the database. We can update some existing data into the database, right? We can delete some data into the database. So that is also that is the thing which is going to be done by the DbContext class, right? And caching means what? Now, so it is one of the useful feature provided by the DbContext class, which is going to improve the application performance. For example, let's assume that your database having 10 records, 10 student informations, and the student ID is going to be from 1 to 10, right? And you fetch all the 10 students from the database and store in the context object. Later, you are using the context class find method to find a student, and you are just providing the student ID as 5. Then in that case, so it will first check whether that student ID with 5 is exist in the context. Yes, it is exist. Then it will return the data from the cached memory, right? It will return the data from the context, right? And if it is not find that record in the context, then only it will go to the database and will try to paste the data. That means the first level of caching, right, is also going to be provided by the database context class. Manage relationship, right? So manage relationship means right, so basically if you are creating the database table by using the primary key and foreign key relationship, right, then whenever you are loading the primary key table data, the corresponding foreign key table data is also going to be loaded automatically. And this is possible because of the one to many relationship, one to one relationship, many to many relationship, right? That means DbContext class also managing the relationships. Object materialization means what? Now, so suppose you are retrieving the raw data from the SQL server, right? Then the DbContext class also take the responsibility to convert those raw data into .NET object. You are returning a single employee data. It will store that data in the employee object. You are retrieving a collection of student. It will store that collection of student, right, raw data into a collection of student type properties, right? Transaction means what? Now, if you want to execute some statement as a unit, some DML statement, you want to execute as a single unit, right? Then that is also possible by the DbContext class. If all the DML operations, right, inside of the delete, whatever you are writing as part of your transaction, right, if all are succeeded, then it will commit the transaction. And if one of the transaction or one of the DML statement is failed, then it is going to roll back the transaction. That means the transaction functionality is also going to be implemented, or this functionality also supported by DbContext class. So these are the different functionality or responsibility, you can also say, provided by the DbContext class, which you can achieve using Entity Framework. Is that clear, guys? Any particular term which you are not understanding? If you are, then I can also explain the same thing again. Clear?
Yes.
Clear,
Yes,
guys?
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Clear. Thank you.
Right. So now if you go to the Entity Framework DbContext class, right, this is the auto-generated code, right, which we have already seen, right? So now, as you can see, okay, this is not required. We have already explained these things. Now let us try to understand how we can perform the database CRUD operation using the DbContext class, right? So, so while I'm going to perform the DbContext class, I'm going to perform the database CRUD operation. Then two things will come into the picture. One is DbSet instance, and the other one is the step changes method, right? So what is the use of step changes? Now, whenever we call the step changes method, right, then based on the entity state, right, what is the state? It is going to generate the appropriate SQL statement, right? So if the entity state is in added state, it is going to generate the insert SQL statement, and if the entity state is modified state, then it is going to generate the, what you can say, update SQL statement, right?
Updated.
Right. So now let us try to understand how we can perform the database CRUD operation, right? Let's start with the add functionality, right? Suppose we want to add a new entity into the database table, right? Suppose you are having this entity, right? Whenever you create this entity, it is not tracked by the context object because it's an independent entity, right? But as soon as you add that entity, right, you add that entity into the student entities collection, right? So once you add that entity to the student collection, right, or you can say once you add that entity into the context object, then that entity will be tracked by the context object, right? As soon as you add this particular student entity into the context object, right, then what will happen? The entity state is going to be modified. What is the entity state for that particular entity? It is going to be added. So the state is going to be in added state. So you can see the added state is there, right? So as soon as you add the entity to the context object, and this is a student entity, so I need to call the add method on the DbSet object, which is referred to student, right? So if you go to the DbSet class, right? So in this case, this DbSet of student, right? DbSet of student is referred by which property? Student's property, right? So you have to call this student's property and then add method, right? In the next, see, after discussing this thing, I will discuss that DbSet part in detail, right? So what is DbSet? How you are, what are, so you are using the add method, where this add method is belongs to, or apart from that add method, what are the other methods is available as part of the DbSet? That is what we are going to discuss next, right? So in this case, whenever you add the element or whenever you add the entity into the context object, the context object will track that entity now, and it will track that entity, and in this case it will track the entity state as added state. So if you want to check what is the entity state, you can use the statement, right? Context dot entry student dot state. So it will return the student in state what is currently referred by this context object, right? And when you call the step changes method, and what is the state of the entity state is added. So for added entity state, it is going to generate insert SQL query, right? And once the step changes method is completed successfully, right? Completed successfully in the sense if the data is added into the database, right? Then what will happen? It is going to change, right? Once the data is stored in the database successfully, and if there is no error while executing the step changes method, then the entity state is going to be changed, right? It is going to move from added state to unchanged state, right? And later, if you want to verify whether that element is added or not, then you can use a for each loop, and you can access the all the elements, and you can check whether that newly added entity, that is what is the name, Hina Sharma and standard ID 1 is there or not. So let me give this as information, right? So and guys, if you want to check, right, this is the thing which is not available. This is the thing which is right. If you want to check what SQL statement is generated by the context class, then there is something called context.database.log, and where you want to log this thing, I want to log this on the console class. right? So you have to write console.write, right? So this statement, this particular statement, right, is going to print whatever the SQL statement is generated for this step changes method when you call, and whenever you access the student's data, whatever SQL statement is generated, right? Those information, those SQL statement, what entity framework is generated, that is going to be uh, provided by this statement context.database.log, and that statement is going to be written on the console, right? In the console, right? Let me run this application. So this is my console window, right? Let me expand this one. This is my console window, right? So what we have written, this console.database.log, right? So when I'm adding, nothing is happened. And when I'm making these changes before save changes entity state, and then I'm calling the save changes method, right? So you can see before save changes entity state is added. This is the statement what was printed. Then what I'm doing, I'm calling the save changes method. So when I'm calling the save changes method, at this point of time, it is going to generate the insert SQL query, right? But what SQL query it is going to generate it when the connection is opened, when the transaction is started, when the transaction is committed, when the connection is closed, right? Those information it is going to printed here. You can see this is the things which is going to be generated by the statement what I have written, right? So you can see. So as I mentioned, the context class will take the responsibility of opening the connection, closing the connection, whether the transaction is committed successfully or committed with error, right? These things, right? So you can say connection is opened at this time, the transaction is started. As part of the transaction, it is executed this insert statement, right? It executed this insert statement. So insert a DBO, student, first name, last name, standard ID, value 0, 1, 2, select, right? So this is the statement which is used by the entity framework to insert the data into the database table. Then if this insertion operation is successful, then it will commit the transaction. Once the transaction is committed, it will close the transaction. So this is how you can verify the SQL statement. Other option is also there. And what is that? By using the SQL Server profiler, right? Suppose you have developed one application, then you should not include this statement, right? If you include this statement, then the user will able to know, right? What is the database name, what is the column name, and all this information. And this information also doesn't make any sense to the UI or to the user, right? Yes, for understanding purpose, whenever you are developing, that is fine. But this should not be the production case, right? And in production, if you want to check, then you have to use the other tool, SQL Profiler. And once the insert data is inserted, then as I mentioned, the entity state will be changed to unchanged. Is that statement is written here? Yes. And after that, what we are doing, we are just using this context.student.toList. So in this case, it is again going to return the data from the student database table by using a select SQL query, and that you can see here. So open connection at this time. And in this case, right, transaction is not required. Why? Because we are not doing any modification to the database. Then why should we use transaction? Right? So you can see, and in this case, transaction is required because we are modifying the database data. In this case, we are simply returning the data. So once you return the data, right, then you can see it is closed the connection, and then it is just printing the data. Clear, guys? Right?
Yes.
And if you want to use this time, so here what you need to do here, this is the statement which is going to generate and the database, right, what is generated by the context class, and where you want to print testing, right? Instead of that, what you can do, you can also create a class, right? If you don't want to print in the console, right, uh, uh, you want to print somewhere else, right? Suppose I'm creating a public class logger, public class logger. and inside this I'm writing public static void log method which is taking string message. And here if you want you can store this information in a text file. If you want you can store this message in the database, or if you, and for simplicity what I'm trying to do, I'm just printing it on the console, right? So now I'm not going to add the student, right? So I'm not going to add the student. I just want to show you the, because the student is already added. So I'm just going to show you how the SQL statement is look like. So in this case, I'm just simply fetching the data and showing it in the console. Right now, run the application. Okay. So I have not done the changes. So in this case, it is also going to do the same thing, right? So instead of console.log, what I need to write? I need to write logger.log. Logger.log, right? So again, if you want to verify, you can also use this SQL profiler tool. What SQL statement is generated, that you can also verify here, right? So what I'm trying to do, I'm just running this application, right? So you can see this is the SQL statement generated by Entity Framework. And if you come and if you check here, the same thing you will find also here, right? So this is I'm fetching from the SQL Server Profiler tool, and this is I'm fetching by using the context.database.log statement, right? So context class will log the database which is generated by the entity framework. This statement is meaning is the meaning of this statement is like, and where you want to log that information you need to provide here. I want to log in this log file, log class to log method. Yes, you have to provide that information here. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So you have two options, whether you can check the database log by using this statement or by using this SQL Server Profiler tool, right? Whichever option you like, you can go. But this will work very good in production environment, because in production environment you cannot log the data in the UI, right? Or you cannot log the data in the console window, because it doesn't make any sense. The user who is using your application, he will see this thing. What are these things? I cannot understand this thing. Yes, my requirement is to know the data. Yes, I'm visible. The data is visible, but what are all these things, right? So these things doesn't make any sense to the user, right? So you should provide the information what is required for the user, and this is for your understanding purpose. You can log this into a log text file or anywhere else as per your requirement, right? So this is how you can perform the insert operation, right? Now, how you are going to perform the update operation, right? So you can see there is a method called first or default, right? So previously what method we have discussed, right? So find method, right? So it is another LinQ method. Okay, so what exactly this find method will do? This is going to be, right, same as this one, right? So previously we have used context.student.find method. In this case, what will happen? Now it will find based on the primary key. It will only work based on the primary key, and this faster default, it will work based on a lambda expression. In the lambda expression, whatever information you want, you can provide, right? Suppose what I want to return the employee whose first name is Hina one, right? Hina, right? So previously we have created one employee, right? What is the name of that employee? Hina, right? So I just want to paste the information whose name is Hina. Then in that case, you have to use this one. You cannot use this one, right? So faster default means what? Now from this student collection, please fetch the student entity whose first name is Hina. If you are finding multiple entity with the first name Hina, then only fetch the first one. If you are not finding any entity or employee or any student with the name Hina, then please create a student object with the default value and that will be stored here. Clear, guys?
Like,
Yes.
here
So
I'm
in
not
this case,
understand.
two things you need to understand: first or default. So first of all, it is the student object, right? So what is the default value of student type? It's a reference
Null.
type. For reference type, what is the default value? For
Null.
integer, what is the default value?
0.
For string, what is the default value?
Null.
Similarly, this is also reference type. Now, the default value is going to be null.
Null.
So this is a method, first or default. So from this and this method expecting one lambda expression. This is the lambda expression you understood, right?
Yes, like here I'm understanding the lambda expression, but I'm not understanding like how we can use that lambda expression inside a method, like a first or default method. So like context of student is a like a whole collection, right?
Right.
Whole
So
database table.
okay. So can I write like this? Can I write like this?
Context student where. So what will be the value of X?
X is nothing but it represents each entity that is written by the student collection, right?
Oh, okay.
Inside the students, you are having many student entities.
Yes.
So if you are using a for each loop, right? Right. Suppose in this case, okay, for each, if I'm writing like some collection, right? So in this case, what this item variable is all
So
about,
item is iterating over the student.
right? That means if the student having 10 number of elements, then each time this loop iterate, it will fetch it will store one of the student value.
Yes.
So in this case, this X is nothing but it is representing the student entity, right? Students means it might be possible that inside this collection, right, or inside this table, you are having one student, two student, 10 students, right?
Hmm.
So each student is referred by this X object.
Okay, so X is iterating over context dot students, right?
Right. So each student you are identifying using this X, and then you are checking whether that student first name is this one or not.
Oh, okay.
Right. And here you are using where filter. So instead of where, I'm using first or default. First or default, what it means? It means what? Now, it means it might be possible that inside the student table, you are having multiple students with the same first name. Is there any difficult? It is also possible that two
Yes.
students with the first name Hina.
Yes.
Yes, but if you are finding two students with the first name Hina, then please only return the first record, right? So the sequence you are filtering from the top to bottom. Once you find any student with the first name Hina, please return that student. Only don't go further. Understand?
Yes, I just got confused because of that first or default method. I thought like how that X is fetching data from first or default, but it's a separate thing. X
Exactly.
represents contested students only.
Exactly. And if you didn't find any student with the first name Hina, then please set the default value based on the data type. What is the data type? Here the data type is student. Student, it's a reference type, so don't throw any kind of error. Just set this value to null. Clear? And in this
Yes.
case, this find method is only going to work with the primary key. We'll discuss this thing later, right? I'm not going to use find method now, right? Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Once the student entity is retrieved, and it will be retrieved with the state as options, right? That is what we have discussed in our entity states session, right? So the entity state will be unchanged. Then what we'll do? Then I'm checking if this student entity is not equals to null. What it means? It means it retrieved some data, right? It stored one student data. Then go and do the modifications, right? I'm updating the first name, I'm updating the last name, and once I update any at least one property, if you update at least one of a property of the student object, right, then the context, right, the context object tracking the student, and you are modifying the property means the state is again automatically going to be modified, and it will show you the update status update state as modified, right? And whenever you call the set changes method, then what will happen? Now it will generate the update SQL statement, execute the update SQL statement in the database, and if it is successfully do this operation, then again it will modify the entity states to unchanged, right? And later, if you want to view whether this modification is done on the database or not, then you can use this for each loop, right? And if you want to check whether, and if you want to check, right, if you want to see what SQL statement is generated, then you can write database.log, and here you can write console.write, right? So you can write this statement, right? Now let me run this application. Right? So you can see this is the statement. First, it is selecting top one record, right? So in this case, what I have used faster default. Faster default means, as I mentioned, it is going to return you only one record, right? And that is going to be first entity name, only one record from the top, and which name is matched with which first name is matched with Hina. Then for this purpose, what SQL statement it is generated? It is generate top one clause. You should know what is this top one, right? So this is a SQL Server statement. This is the reason why I'm saying from the beginning, right? You should have very good knowledge of SQL, right? And if you do not know what is top one clause, right, then it will be difficult for you to understand the concept, right? So any question related to this select statement, guys?
No question.
Right, so basically from the student table it is selecting top one record where the first name is equivalent to Hina, right? And once it retrieve the data, so retrieved entity state is unchanged, right? So initially I have printed that entity state, then I modify the entity, so modified entity state is going to be modified, right? Then I'm updating then I'm calling the save changes method. While I'm calling the save changes method, it is generating the update SQL statement, right? And this is a update SQL statement means this is a DML operation. DML operation means it is going to start a transaction, right? So the transaction is started, the transaction is committed, right? And then after set changes, the entity state again modified to unchanged, and then I'm fetching all the data, and you can see Hina 1 server 1. That means the data is modified as expected. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right. So now we are going to discuss how you can perform the delete operation, right? So delete operation is also very simple. So what you need to do, you need to call the remove of method on the DbSet object, right? So DbSet class provides one method called remove. That is what we need to fetch, right? So what I need to do, I don't want to use standard id. I want to use first name, and the first name is going to be Hina1. I have updated that name. Hina1, right? So it is going to return me the object before deleting entity state. If or this entity is not null, then it will call this remove method, and to this remove method we need to pass the student object, right? And after deleting, what will be the states? But guys, remember, once you execute this statement, right, and once you execute this statement, do you think that the data is going to be deleted from the database?
No.
So it is just removing the data from the
From the memory.
context, right, from the context object, and it will remove that object from the context and it will mark that state as deleted. But the data is not deleted from the database. And whenever you are calling this changes method, then only the delete SQL statement is going to be generated and executed on the database, and then the database is going to delete that particular record from the database. Once that delete operation is successful, then what should be the state of this entity?
Unchanged.
How unchanged?
Can you
So
ask again?
once the data is deleted from the database, right, then what
Yes.
should be the state of this entity?
Detach.
Exactly, detached. Because in our entity state article, entity state session, we have already discussed this thing. Once the data is deleted, do you think that context object is going to track that record anymore?
No.
Because that record is deleted, then what you will track? If context object is not tracking something, that means what should be the state of that entity? Which entity state is not going to be tracked by the context object? Only detached state, na? Right?
Yes.
So in this
Yes.
case, once the data is deleted from the database, then you will see, right, the state is detached, and this once the state is detached, means this student object is no longer available to this context object. And once you delete, then you can verify that data should not be there in the list, right? Let me run this application. Right? Unchanged, then delete, then detached. And you can see here one record is not there. And if you want to see what SQL statement it is execute, you can see delete student where student ID equals to 0. ID. So whatever the student ID, that based on that student ID, it is going to delete the record. Clear?
Yes.
Right. And now can anybody tell me why it is using student ID to delete the record? I'm fetching the data based on the first name, but while deleting the data, it is using student ID. Why? Right?
Because
That
that
is the
is the
primary
unique
key.
ID.
Exactly. That is the primary key. And whenever you are going to perform some kind of updation, right, deletion, then the where condition should be based on the primary key, because the indexes are existing on the primary key, right? So, and if you are doing some kind of operation using the indexes, then it is going to use the index scan, not the table scan. What is the difference between index scan and table scan? Can anybody tell me?
In tables, can SQL Server reads the data from start to end one by one, and in table can it directly jumps to the index position.
Right, right. So in the case of an index scan, it will make use of an index table, and based on the index number, right, it will directly jump to the particular data that is available in your actual table, right? And there is no lookup, right? And in the case of a table scan, it will go to the table directly and it will search for that record line by line. So which is going to take more time. And because of that reason, right, it is using what it is using. Where is that statement? Right, it is using that student ID in the where condition clause, right? So this is how you can perform the CRUD operation. Obviously I'm showing insert, update, delete, but in each operation I'm also showing you the select operation, right? Because here while you are fetching the data, it is making use of your select SQL query, right? Clear, guys?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. So next, what we are going to discuss, we are going to discuss DbSet. So see, whenever I'm going to discuss a new concept, already before starting that concept, I have given you something, some hint and some example, right, of those concepts, right? So can anybody tell me what is the use of a DB context?
DbContext is used to manage the CRUD operation on the object.
Right. So DbContext class represent an entity set that can be used for the database call operation. Right. So if you go and check your context class, then each entity are added to the DbSet. That means this DbSet class actually performing the CRUD operation. Right. And if you go to your class, right here, I'm calling the remove method, and I'm calling the remove method on the students property, right? And if you go and check the student property, it is nothing but a DbSet property. Similarly, if I'm going to do some addition operation, then I'm going to call the add method on the student's property, right? So this means what? That the DbSet actually doing the database CRUD operations, right, on the entities. The DbSet class in Entity Framework represents an entity set that can be used for the database CRUD operation, right? So using this DbSet class, we are actually performing the create, read, update, and a delete operation. So in this case, you can see I'm calling the remove method on the student's property. What is the student property? It's a DbSet only. If I'm calling the student's property under toList method, right? Here the toList means it is fetching all the data from the student. So what is the student? It is nothing but it's a DbSet, right? That means this DbSet class actually provide the functionality and flexibility to perform the database CRUD operations. Yes, on top of the context object only we are going to do this thing. Why? Because this is only the context class now. Once you create an instance of this class, then I can access this property. And once I am accessing this property, then whatever functionality, whatever method, all these things provided by this DbContext class, those methods are going to be used. Guys, give me 1 minute. Okay, so basically this DbSet class provides the flexibility to add, update, write, insert, delete, right, select data from the database, right? Now we are going to proceed, and we need to understand what are the methods provided by this DbSet class and how we can use those methods to perform different types of operations, right? So in this case, you can see this is nothing but your DbSet of entity, right? This is nothing but your entity set, right? Inside this DbSet, you can add entity, and all those entity are going to be added as entity set, right? And now we need to go further and understand the different methods provided by the DbSet class, right? So one of the method is add method. So what is the use of this add method? Means it is going to add, right, the entity to the context object with the state as added, and whenever we call the save changes method, that entity is going to be added into the where it is going to add. Just give me 1 minute. I have not updated the content here. Okay. Right. So this is the add method, right? Let me show you the add method in detail, right? I have not updated the content. I have to do these things manually. Okay. So add method. Let us first discuss the add method. I'm creating a student object. Variable student equals to new student. Not new student. I'm creating a new student. And within this student, I'm adding few properties. I'm adding some name, first name equals to name, and I'm adding last name equals to, okay, I have updated the content in my website. Okay. DbSet in Entity Framework. This is my website. Okay. Right. So guys, today I'm going to explain this concept using my website, because the document what I'm showing here, it is not updated one, right? I have updated on my website, but not here, right? So you can see this is the add method, right? The add method is basically going to add one entity, right, to the context object. And once that entity is added, that state will be in added state. And whenever you call the save changes method, right, that entity is going to be stored in the database. And once that entity is stored in the database, the state is going to be changed, right? And what will be the changed state? It is going to be unchanged, right? And the example is given here, right? So in this case, you can see I'm creating one student object, adding that student before the save changes method, what is the state, and after the save changes method, what is the state. We have already discussed this add method so far, right? So it will not be that difficult for you to understand this add method. And on which object I'm calling this add method? I'm calling the add method based on the return type of the student property, right? So in this case, what is the return type of the student property? The return type of student property is a DbSet. On this DbSet, I'm calling this add method, right? Now, if you go to the add method definition, then you will see that it is a generic class and DbSet of a T entity. And in this case, what is the T entity? T entity in this case, it is nothing but your student. That means I'm going to perform the add operation on the student entity, right? And in this case, as student entity, I need to provide one entity of type student. And once you add, so there is no documentation is given. That means in this case, the student will be added to the context object with the state added, right? And when you call this changes, the data is going to be stored in the database, right? And if you want to see what kind of SQL statement is generated by the context class, right? So you have to write context dot database dot log, and where you want to log, I want to log on the console window, so you have to write console dot write, right? So in this case, you will see the insert SQL statement which is generated by the Entity Framework context class, right? So right before save changes added, and here it is generating the insert statement, and after save changes the state is changed to unchanged, right? And in this case, it is for the student ID, it is using sometimes some scope identity. And you know what is scope identity? So it is going to generate a unique integer value, right? So in this case, this is the use of add method. We have already discussed this add method. So don't focus on this add method, right? Now what I'm going to discuss, I'm going to discuss the add range method, right? So what exactly the add range method, right? Suppose in
I have
okay,
a query.
yeah, ask me.
Okay, in this code on line number 24, at the end you said like a dot state is checking a state of like a contest object or like a student entity.
So it will going to check the student entity state, but this student entity state should be tracked by this context object, right? If the student entity is not tracked by this context object, then it will not fetch. I mean, so in this case, what is the state? State of the student entity only, na?
Okay.
Right? It might be possible that you are having right. So in this case, right, I'm creating two students, right? I'm creating student one, student two, right? Like this. Then currently I'm having two students. Then in this case, which student state you want to check? You want to state student one, or you want to check student two? I want to check the student two entity state, right? So that is what you need to write here. That entity you need to provide. So this basically context dot entity. This is the syntax, and within this function, you need to provide the entity which state you want to check.
Okay.
Clear? You
Yes,
want to
please.
check student one, student two, anything, right? And in this case, guys, if you remember this add method, to this add method, I'm passing a single entity because it is expecting one T entity, right? So I'm passing a single entity, and in this case, it might be student or it might be student two. But if you are having a collection, if you are having a collection of student, then you cannot pass that collection of student to this add method. And for that purpose, you have to use the add range method, right? You have to use the add range method. In this case, I'm having a list of students. Now I want to add all these three students, right? All these three students into the where I want to add all these three students into the database, right? Then for that purpose, what you need to use? You need to use add range method, right? So to this add range method, now if you go and check, so it is not expecting T entity, right? It is expecting one I enumerable. I enumerable means a collection, right? And here I'm implementing this list of student type. I can pass this because it implements the I enumerable of T, right? If you go to the definition, then you will see that list of T implement I enumerable of T. That means for the list class, I enumerable T is the parent class. So can I pass a child class object and store that object in a parent class reference variable? Guys,
Yes.
oops
Yes.
concept come into the picture only. Right? So in this case, if you go to the definition and if you are thinking, sir, the parameter type is enumerable and here I'm passing the list, how is that possible? It is possible because this list is a child of enumerable class, and as enumerable is the parent of this list, so I can pass the student parameter, and that is going to be stored by the parent reference variable, right? So in this case, I'm having three entities, right? So entity one, entity two, entity three, right? And I'm adding all these three entity by using the add range method. Now, if you want to use add, then this is not going to work because add method accept a entity, and here you are passing a collection of entity. So add method is not suitable. So for that purpose, you need to use the add range method, right? And if you want to check, right, what is the, see, in this case, you cannot pass this students to this entry method because the student is not an entity. It is a collection of entities, right? And for that purpose, if you try to pass students, right, then you will get some error, right? Now let me run this application and see it is going to throw me some kind of error because student is not an entity. Inside student, many entities are there. See, the entity type list is not part of the model of the current object. So you cannot pass students. You have to pass student. So student means what? Now each entity, right? So whenever I'm looping through, each entity will be stored inside this variable. And if you are getting confused, then make this instead of a bar, make this as student, right? Now the first student entity is going to stored inside this variable. And when the loop will execute for the second time, this information will be stored here. And the third time, this information will be stored here. Now, on each time, I'll just make this student to be checked in entity state, right? So in this case, it is going to give me the state of each entity. Then I'm calling the step changes method. And once the step changes method is called, right, then the state, so in this case, the state is added. And once the step changes is done, the database is saved in the database. So the state is going to be unchanged. It will move to unchanged, right? Now, in this case, if you want to check, right, what database the code is generated by the step changes method, then you need to call this one database dot log and console dot write, right? Console dot write. So now run the application. All right, guys, see, in this case, you have to observe one thing. One insert statement, right? And you can see the transaction started, right? Open the connection, then transaction started. Within this transaction, first it execute one insert statement, then it execute another insert statement, then it execute another insert statement, and then only if all these three insert statements are completed, then only it is going to commit the transaction, right? And you can see before the save changes method, what is the state? The state is added. After the save changes, the state is modified, right? So the point that you need to remember, right? So if you are using the add range method, then don't think that it is going to improve your application performance. Why? Because it doesn't matter whether you call the add method 3 times or whether you use the add range method 3 times. Why? Because behind the scene, 3 times it is going to the database only, right? It is, yes, the difference is that in this case, each time, in this case, all these three statements are written within a transaction. At that time, each independent transaction will be there, right? So this is the difference. So in this case, whenever you use the add range method, then in that case, to add each record, right, it is going to the database one by one, right? Don't think that all these three records are sent to the database, and from the database it is going to do a some other kind of activities to store the data, right? So there are 3 round trips between your .NET application to the database. Clear? Right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
later I will show you how we can improve the performance, right? I will show you if you are going to add a collection of a record, bulk of a record, then you should not use the add range method. Then what method we need to use, and how you are going to use, that is what we are going to discuss in our coming sessions, right? But for now, this is one of the method which is provided by the context class. Clear?
Yes.
Right? Right.
Yes.
The next method, what we are going to discuss, the attach method. So attach method means what? Now by default, one entity is not going to be tracked by the context object, right? So in this case, if you want to track this entity, right, by this context object, then first of all, you need to attach that entity to the uh, context object. And to attach that entity, you need to call the attach method, right? And once you attach that entity to the attach method, then in that case, the state of the entity is going to be unchanged state. And if you call the save changes method, do you think that this entity is going to be added into the database? Guys?
No.
No. Yes. See, if the database is in added state, then it is going to generate which SQL statement?
Insert.
Insert. If the database entity state is in modified state, then it is going to generate which SQL statement? Update. If the database, if the entity is in deleted state, it is going to generate which SQL statement? Delete, right? And if it is unchanged, even though you call the save changes method, nothing is going to be happen. Nothing is happening, right? And for detached, it is detached means not a tracking. It is not a tracking, right? Not a tracking means if you do any modification to the detached state, then it is not going to be do anything with the database, right? In this case, right? In this case, what is the state? So once you add one entity, right, to the context object, do not add. If you attach one entity to the context object, then by default it is going to be in unchanged state. And in unchanged state, if you call the save changes method, then nothing is happening in the database, right? So it is not going to add that elements into the database. So before save changes and after save changes, that state is going to be unchanged, right? So in this case, it is going to be unchanged, right? And in this case, if you try to observe the database log, then again, it is not going to generate anything, right? Okay, let me prove that also. So in this case, context dot database dot log equals to console dot right. So in this case, nothing is going to be happen. Right? So no SQL statement, because whenever the save changes method is called, it will check the state of the entity, and entity state is unchanged. Unchanged means it is not going to do anything. Clear, guys?
Yes, so like here on line number 15, 16, and 17, the data are like a Hina, Sarma, and the student ID is 1. So if there is a difference in data, like in database and here, then also it will not like
See,
change into database.
see, it's going to be a completely new element,
Okay.
right? And if you add one data with exactly, so by default, whenever you attach, right? Or if you see in this case, okay, so to make you understand, what I can do is I'm doing something like this.
I just want to see like if difference in data, then and then we attach any entity, then also it will not.
See, it's a new, it's a difference in the sense what? It's a new record,
Yes, yes.
right? And if you want to see the difference, right? Let me open this one, right? Hina, what is the ID?
10.
10. Okay, so let me add that student ID equals to 10,
10.
right? And
Yes.
Hina Sarma, let me put this as a 2 and let me put this as a 2, right?
Yes.
So in this case, what will happen? See, what happened?
Unchanged.
Right? So basically, whenever you attach the student to this student's collection, right, its state is unchanged. Unchanged state means if you call this method, then nothing is going to be happen.
Okay. Then
Right?
why we are attaching like a.
Why you are attaching, right? Later, if you want to add this object to the database, then you can add to this thing,
Okay.
right? Okay, now let me do one thing. Okay, let me or delete this one. Right? Let me delete this one, right? And now I want to add this element to the database, right? You just created this element for your one operation, and after the operation is successful, now you want to add that element to the database, right? And later you want to decide, right? Some condition, based on the condition, you want to decide whether I need to add or not, right? And later, if you want to add this object, right, then you can write context dot students dot add method, and to this add method, now you need to push this one, right? And once you push this one, then again call the set changes method, right? So now the state is moved to, right? So in this case, after first set changes, the state is going to be still okay. So right, after set changes one, entity state is this, right? And after save changes 2, the entity state is this, right? And before
Yes.
save changes 2, right? So once you add this, then what will be the state of this entity?
If we add.
Yes, yes. In this statement, I have added, so in this case, I have attached. In this case, I have added the entity to the context object. So in this case, what should be the state of this student entity?
Added.
Added. So if the
Yes.
student entity is added, that means next when I'm calling the save changes method, is it going to generate the insert SQL statement,
Yes. After save changes, it will insert into
right?
SQL.
So this is the use of this thing. If you do not,
Okay.
if you want to only do some kind of operation, but you don't want to add that element into the database, right? Then you need to attach. If you want to add, then you can add. So attach means it is tracking by the student, tracking by the context class. Add means it is also tracking by the context class. But in this case, once you call the set changes method, that entity is not going to be added into the database. In this case, once you call the step changes method, that entity is going to be added into the database. Now it's up to you whether you want to do some operation on the data, right? If you want to do some kind of operation, but you don't want to add that entity to the database, then you need to use the attach, right? And if you want that, yes, I want to add that element, I want to do the operation, but also I want to add that element into the database, then you need to go with the add method. Clear?
Okay, so here you said like on line but 21 we are using dot attach method. So basically it's attaching entity, right? So like and you said like some kind of operation. So like without attaching we cannot perform any kind of operation. I'm not talking about like added, deleted, modified. Like is there any other operation which we require? Like first of all we need to attach, then only we can perform.
See, what I'm saying you, okay. So students, right? Variable students, right? Variable students equals to, I'm writing context dot students, right? Where where x start x start x dot student id is less than equals to 4 dot to list. So in this case, right, the context object, right, in this case the context object is fetch, how many records it is going to fetch?
Less than 4, so 1 2 1 2 3
Less
4
than
5 6.
equals to means 1 2 3 4.
Yeah.
Less than equals to means these 4 records are fetched by the context object. Later
Yes.
you attach this context object, right? Later you attach this context object
Yes.
to this, here you attach this context object, right? Now
Yes.
what I'm trying to do is,
Click. Yes,
hmm,
please. No, nothing.
variable, okay, context dot students dot find method, right? So in this case, there is no definition. Hello.
Yes.
My audio is visible. Am I audible to all of you?
Yes. Right now,
Yes,
I guess
right now.
you were preparing a example. I guess that's why.
Okay, no, no. Someone asked me, I'm not audible. That's why I'm asking.
No, no, you-
Okay, okay, fine, fine. So in this case, see, okay, right. So in this case, you have created the student one entity, you have attached that, and then you have modified the student one entity. Now, right now, if you call the step changes method, it is going to add that entity with the database, right? Now it is going to add that entity with the database with this modified value, right? Let me run this one.
I guess you have attached, so there will be no change. I guess.
No, no, we have made the changes now.
No,
See,
like
in this case, what happened? See, in this case, right, we have attached the element to the context object, right? So
yes,
as we have attached that element to the context object, it is going to tracked by the, I mean, it is going to tracked by the context, right? So in this case,
yes,
say initially it is attached. Attached means the state is what? On, so in this
unchanged.
case, on change, right? So tracked means what? Tracked means it is going to keep track if you are doing any kind of modification or any kind of operation. So here you have modified the entity, right? As you
Yes.
have modified the entity, the state will be changed to modified, right? And later, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to, okay, what is the context? Okay, context dot students. And here, what I'm trying to do, students dot remove, right? Remove, and here I'm removing the object, right?
But
So here I'm
online.
removing, sorry. So
Sorry.
in this case, the tracking is done by the context object, right? So in this case, you can see as this element is not added or inserted into the database, still you can do the updation, you can do the addition, you can do the modification from the context object, right? So in this case, by default, it is going to show you the state as unchanged. It is going to show you the state as modified. It is going to show you the state as deleted, right? Now,
Okay, so you are performing everything, all operation in memory only, not on
right,
database.
right. So you can say unchanged, modified, and deleted, right? But the
Yes.
thing is that if I'm not going to right, if I'm not attaching this one, right? If I'm not attaching this one, then see what is the state is going to show you. I'm not attaching the student object, then what will happen?
It will give error because it will not find the object.
Right? So basically what happened, if you want to, if you want any object to be tracked by the
Mhm.
context object, right? Only tracked, but you don't want to add that object, right? You don't want to more apply that changes to the database, right? And you need to use this attach method, right? So
Yes.
instead of add, right? So if I use this attach, right, now you can track these things, right? And you can see this is happening, right? Even though I'm going to call the step changes method, it is right. But in this case, instead of add, even if I'm doing this add method here, right, and whenever I'm calling the step changes, it will do these changes permanently into the database, right?
Yes.
So basically, this add is going to track and this attach is going to track, but these changes are going to be on data on in memory. If you are attaching, if you are using add means it is going to be added state. Added state means it is going to be, I mean, it is going to be affected in the database when you call the step changes method, right?
But you have called that the save changes method on line number 39. So like you are attaching, you are changing, and you are removing. So basically there will be no change on the database.
Exactly.
Okay, but if you put that save changes on line number 33, then it will add, but it will
See,
if you,
right? So in this case, I cannot call this changes method. I right in this case, this object, right? It is going to be tracked by the context of the context object, but you cannot make these changes to the database, right? But instead of attach, if I call the add method, right, then
Yes.
you will see I'm not going to get any kind of a error, and it is going to be right. Oh, in this case, this remove is fast, right? Right?
Yes.
Understand?
Yes. Yes. Perfectly. So like so if you put that save changes method after add, so it will add into database, it will done the modification on the in the memory, and it will remove from the memory. So like there will be data into database if you add save changes after add method.
So see, here you meant to say that.
Yes, so it will add into database, then it will
Yes,
do modification on memory only. It will remove from
exactly.
the memory only, but it will not perform any action on database side.
Right, let's do this thing once more, right? So let me give this as 2.
But do not
MS
put save changes on line number 40. Only put on line number 33 only.
only line number 33. Yes, in this case,
33.
it will be added, and but this modification will not take effect in the database.
Database, yes,
And
yes.
this deletion is not going to be happen in the database, right?
Database side, yes.
Right. So in this case, so what is the latest one is 13, right? So let me run this one. See, in this case, you can see modified and deleted entity state, but that record is not going to be deleted from the database. 14 you should be
Database.
there. Hina and
Yes,
Sharma 2 is there, right?
yes, yes.
Understand?
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
But sir, like, what is the purpose? Like, if we are not modifying it to database, like,
See, there are two things. I don't think that whenever you are doing the operation, always you are going to do the, I mean, always you are going to update the data in the database. Sometimes from the user's point of view, you need to do some kind of in-memory operations, right? And to perform those in-memory operations, you need to use, you do not need to add that, I mean, you do not need to add that entity to the context object. Instead, you need to attach that entity to the context object so that you can track, right, whether the entity is whether that attached entity is modified, whether the attached entity is deleted or not. And if you want to track that thing in memory but don't want to do this kind of but you don't want to update this thing in the database, then you need to use the attachment, right?
Yes, I guess we can perform such operations. So for an example, if we have one Excel file, and in
Right,
one Excel file we have 100 data, like we are loading all 100 data here, like attaching, and then we can use the filter, like only
exactly.
save the data into database which has like marks
Some
more than 8,
condition, some mark,
some
if
condition.
mark is greater than this, then you need to add that data into the database, right? Then in
Database,
that
yes.
case, first of all, you need to attach everything. Then from this attached, right? Then you, if the whatever the condition is satisfied, just change that entity state to add it, right? By calling the add method. Rest will be
Yes,
as it is, right?
yes, yes.
In
But
that
before,
case, in your in memory, every data is there, but whichever the filter data, those are going to be stored into the database.
yes, but for the filter, first of all, we need to load the data into memory. So for that
Right.
purpose, we can use that attachment. Yes.
Right. So in that for that purpose, you need to use the in this attached data. Right. So see, guys, see, once you do practices now, then you will able to know what is the use of this thing. So only practice required, because but I know you guys are not practicing. Then if you are not practicing, this type of things will come into the picture, right? Why I'm saying you guys are not practicing, because I have given 3 tags. Out of 3, only 2 people, and those are from outside of India. 2 people and one from India, I guess, provided the solution. And what about others? If you are not providing the solution, means what? You are not doing the practices. And if you are not doing the practices, means what? Right? So you have to do practices. Until and unless you are not doing practices, then you will not. See, in this case, I'm showing the attach method. You have to do. So you have to do modify, you have to do delete. Once modify, call the save changes method. Once delete, call the save changes method, and see what is happening, whether the data is updated into the database or not, whether the data is going to be deleted or not, right? Once you do these things, practices by yourself, then you will able to learn many things, right? And if you think that whatever I'm explaining, I'm only explaining the concept, right? I'm going to explain as per my experience, but apart from that, many things are there, many resources you need to do, right? In this case, if I'm using the attach method, I just show you the example using attach method, right? And in this case, see, I'm calling the save changes method. Here I'm calling the save changes method, right? And here I'm also calling the save changes method, right? In this case, right, what will happen? It will give me some error, and that makes sense, right? Because we are not adding anything. Then if you are not adding, nothing is in added state, this is going to return me some error, right? Now what you can do, you can create the student object, right? You can create the student object. Instead of attach, now you can write this student object too, and here you need to write the add method, right? And add methods too, right? And here I'm just going to modify the student too, right? Student too. And here I'm just going to remove the student too. So in this case, is it going to give me some error, or what is going to happen, right? Okay, so let's see these things. Right, it is going to give me some error here. Why this error? Now, our store update insert delete statement affected an unexpected number of rows. Entities may have been modified or deleted since the entities were loaded. That means there is a mismatch. There is the number of records are going to be updated, and there is a confusion. There is I mean, there is some differences. What differences? Now here it is trying to update, right? It is trying to update two records, right? In this case, student entity 1 and student entity 2. Two records it is going to update in the database, but the student 1, is the student 1 available in the database, guys?
No.
Then if the student 1 is not available in the database, then this is the reason why it is giving this error, right? So
Yes.
these things, once you do practices, right, why it is not giving, what error message it is giving me, right? Just try to read the error message, right? Once you read the error message 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, then you will understand what exactly the problem is, right?
Yes.
And until and unless you guys are not doing practices, then, right, nothing is going to be happen, because practicing is important, right? So the next important method what we are going to discuss is as no tracking, right? What is as no tracking, right? As no tracking means, okay, right? In this case, right? In this case, what I'm doing, I'm not using the no tracking method, right? By default, whenever the student data is returned, what should be the state of each student, guys?
What did you ask?
So in this case, I'm retrieving all the students from the student database and storing inside this variable, right? So in this case, the context object will track each student in which state,
The state will be unchanged.
unchanged, right? And then I'm just and then I'm modifying each student data, right? Then what should be the student state?
Modified.
Modified, right? And then when I call this step changes method, right, the changes are going to be updated in the database.
Yes.
And then what should be the state again?
It will be unchanged.
Unchanged, right? So let me do this thing. So currently I'm not calling this step changes method because I don't want to update the data. But for understanding purpose, you can see here unchanged and here modified, right? Because before initially it is going to be unchanged, and once you modified, it is going to be modified, right? Let me run this application. So it is unchanged and it is modified. Now what I'm going to do, instead of this syntax, I'm using this syntax, right? Instead of this syntax, I'm using this syntax. So what this node tracking method will tell us, that now the context object, whatever the data written by this query, right, it is not going to be tracked by the context object. If it is not tracked, right, then what should be the state of the entity? Whenever the context object is not tracking one entity, in which state?
Detested.
Right? So in this case, the state of the entity is going to be detached. Right? In detached state, if you are doing any modification, do you think that this modification is tracked by the context object?
No.
So
No.
again, in this case, even though you modify the data, it is going to be in detached state, right? And in this case, even though you call this save changes method, right? Do you think that the data is going to be affected in the database?
No.
Right? So in this case also nothing is going to be happen, right? So now let me run the application. Why I'm getting this error? Console, right line, student list. Right? So in this case, right, run the application and see the no. What are the error? DB does not contain a definition state. Where is the issue? Here. Right? See, detached, right? Even though we have modified, right? But still the modification does not affect in the database, and all the data in this case is going to be in detached state. And the reason is this is not going to be tracked by the context object, right? So in your application, right, sometimes in your application, sometimes you need to fetch the data and you are sure that this data is only for a displaying purpose, right? And you do not want to do any kind of insert, update and delete operations, right? Then in that case, you need to use this as node tracking method. So this as node tracking method will make sure that the collection or the data what is written by this context object is not going to be tracked, right? If it is not tracking, that means internally the performance is going to be improved. Why? Let's say nothing is free in this world, right? If context object is tracking the if the context object tracking the entities, means what? Internally it is executing some logic to track the student object or not. See, if you are doing some modification, it is automatically tracked that student object is modified, so it is going to change the state to modify. That means it is not automatically, it is for us it is automatically, right? But behind the scene some logic should be written there or not.
Yes.
That means that logic, whenever you are running the application, that logic is going to be executed, or without executing it is doing all these things.
It will execute that logic.
It is if it is executing something behind the scene, right? That means that will take some time, or it is going to be without time.
Yes, it will consume some resources.
Right? That means if you are sure that I'm not going to do any kind of insert, update or delete operation on the data which is written by the context object, and if you are 100% sure, then always it is better to use this as no tracking option. Once you mark this as no tracking option, right, the logic that is what internally it is executed to track the state of the entity is going to be skipped, which is going to improve the application performance. Clear, guys?
Yes.
So this
Yes.
is, sorry,
Yes, sir.
Yes. Yeah.
clear. Okay. This is the use of as node tracking method, right? So next one is data DbSet data create method, right? So
Then
DbSet,
attach, sorry,
sorry,
then attach method and this as no tracking will be same then, is
no,
it
no,
so?
you are going in a wrong direction, right? So in the attach method, we are just creating one entity and adding that entity to the context object. And in the case of a attach method, the context object is tracking the entity, right? whether you are updating that entity, whether you are deleting that entity, that is tracked by the context object. But that changes is not affected to the database. In this case, you are fetching the data from the database, and on the fetched data, you don't want to track the data.
Okay.
Right? The attach means what? You are not updating or inserting that data into the database, right? But you want to track that data. And in this case, as no tracking means what? You are not tracking the result which is written by this context class. Right? This context object returning me list of student, and I don't want to track those list of student, and for that purpose, I'm using no track. Clear, guys?
So only if there is a tracking, then database transaction, it is going to save that into database.
If you are not using this no tracking method, means this is the student list, this is also going to happen. But in this case, whatever modification you have done, and whenever you are calling the save changes, those modifications are going to be I mean, these modifications are going to be updated into the database.
Yes.
And if you are using no tracking, means it is not a tracking anymore. It is not tracking anymore means if you, even though you are modifying this data, right, these are in memory, right? And these changes is not tracked by the context class, and hence when you call the save changes method, nothing is going to be happen into the database, because these changes are not tracked by the context class.
Okay.
Clear, guys?
Yes.
So
Yes.
I just want to know, where is the confusion?
No, I don't have confused.
Burger?
Yes, like what my confusion is in this case, like attach will take the object into memory and ask and
See,
it manipulates.
attach will attach that entity into the context object,
Correct. Yeah.
right? And once it attaches that entity into the context object, that means context object will track that entity or not.
Yes.
If it will track, if the context object track the attached entity, right? And if you modify by default, the entity state is going to be unchanged. If you modify that entity, then the entity changed will be changed to modified. If you remove that entity, then the entity state will be deleted. That means what? Now the attached object are going to be tracked by the context object, right? But in this case, this you are using no tracking. No tracking means what? Now the state is going to be in detached state, whether you modify, delete, and do any kind of operations, right? In this case, you can see by default it is not in the see by default if you are attaching, right? Okay, let me give you one example, right? I'm creating one student object variable, student equals to new student, right? Right. So I'm just creating one student with the default value, right? Let me give a new student, attached student, right? So in this case, what I'm doing, I'm attaching that student. I'm at context dot attach, context dot students dot attach method. To this attach method, I'm attaching the student, right? Attaching the student, right? Now the context object will track this student, this attached student. But this context object will not track this list of student which is written by this query, right? So in this case, right? So in this case, let me print this statement here, right? Let me print this statement, entities with a attached, right? So in this case, you can see, so what I'm doing, I'm printing this state. So in this case, right, you just tell me, for this student list, what should be the state?
Unchanged.
How unchanged? What method it is using?
Okay. It is not tracking anything.
It is not a tracking. It is not a tracking means what should be the state? Okay,
Detached.
first tell me what are the different states?
one is added,
added,
modified,
then
unchanged, detached,
then deleted,
delete.
right? So in this case, as you are using as no tracking, then what should be the state?
Detached.
Detached, right? So in this case, the state is going to be detached. But for this attached object, this is one entity. So in this collection, we have list of entities, but this is a single entity, right? And what should be the state of this entity?
Unchanged.
Unchanged, right? So now you understand, if you are using no tracking, then the state is going to be detached. But if you are attaching, then the state is going to be unchanged, right?
Yeah.
In this case, I'm modifying all the entities which is stored inside this collection. Does this modification affect the state of these entities which is stored inside the student list collection?
No.
Then what should be the state in this case?
Detached.
Detached. Right now, what I'm going to do, this is my attached entity, right? And I'm just going to this attach, attach student dot first name, right? Sorry, first name equals to some value, right? Some value. I'm modifying the state, right? I'm not calling this method. I'm just modifying the state. So once I modify this state, right? And then what should be the state of the entity?
Modified.
Modified, right? So the state is going to be modified. Why it is modified?
Because it is tracking.
And why this statement, why in this case the state is going to be still detached?
Because it is not tracking.
Now you understand the difference between as no tracking and the attach method?
Yes, sir. But in both the cases, it will not affect the database. Is it?
Yes, it is not affecting the data. See, it is not affecting the database. That's why we are using no tracking. We are using no tracking means the changes, right? In this case, the changes, see, in this case, if you are not using no tracking, right? That means the changes will be affect to the database. If you are using no tracking means you are sure, right? So in this case, no tracking means what? It is not going to be tracked at all. Don't take that concept database into the picture, right? In this case, no tracking means this is not going to be tracked by the context class. Attach means it is going to be tracked by the context class. That is the simple definition.
Oh.
Database will come into the picture later, but first of all, we need to understand the basic thing. Basic thing is that no tracking means it is not going to track by the context object. Attach means it is going to track by the context object, right? Later in this case, right? If you are not sure, right? Later in this case, if you want, then you can also add that entity to the database. If you want, you can add this entity to the database. How? Now, later somewhere you have to call the add method and you need to pass that entity, and that is going to be added into the database.
Okay. Got it.
Right? Simple definition. No tracking means it is not going to track by the data, not going to track by the context class object. Attach means it is going to track by the context, right? The next one, what we are going to discuss is the create method, right? So what is exactly this create method? Now creating new entity using the DbSet.create method, the entity will be created with the default value based on the data type of the properties, right? Entity will be in detached state and hence will not be tracked by the context object, right? So what it means? So in this case, I'm using context.students.create method. So it is going to create a new student object and return that student object to me. See, in this case, it is simple like this. In this case, right, this statement is very similar to this statement only. This statement is very similar to this statement only. So in this case, what is the difference? The difference is that this is the new student to object will be created with the default values of the property student ID, first name, last name, standard ID. Based on the data type, what is the default value? With that default value, this object is going to be created. In this case, also the object, right? One student entity or student object is going to be created with the default value. The difference is that in this case, that the student will be created with the detached state, and in this case the student has no link with the context object, because we have not attached add or we are not doing anything with the context object. There is no link between the context object and the student and a new student to entity, right? But in this case, this new student entity, even though created using the context object, right? But as you are creating this object using the create method, right? So it is going to be in. So I don't know why the documentation is not provided, right? So this create method, as you are creating the object using the create method, so it is going to be in detached state, right? So once it is in detached state, right? And when you call the step changes method, does it store that entity into the database?
No. No.
No. So in this case, you will see the state is detached, and in this case, the state is going to be detached, right? And this method I never used in any of my projects, right? So, but there is some option. You can create an object like this, right? But I never used this one in my project, because if I'm not going to add that entity, right, then why should I going to use this syntax? I can go with this syntax, right? And in this case, you cannot track the entity using this method, right? So you cannot track because it is not tracking, right? So you can see the state as detached, right? So whether if you want to create an object, you can go with this approach or you can go with this approach. It's up to you, right? But in this case, in both the approach, the state is going to be in detached. Detached state means what? It is not tracking by the context object. If it is tracking, then apart from the detached state, any other state it is going to display, right? In this case, new student, it is showing this detached, and for new student 2, it is also showing detached. Detached means the context object not tracking that entity. Clear? So you have two options to create the detached object. Directly, you are you know the syntax from the beginning, and another syntax is this one. Clear, guys?
Yes, sir.
Mm.
So whichever syntax you like, you can go with that syntax. DbSet dot include method, right? It is one of the important method, right, that you need to understand, right? So
Okay, but sorry, one question. In
yes.
the previous, you have two options to create the object, right? But in the first one, it's already in the context, so you can use it. While in the second case, you cannot use it in the context, right?
No, you cannot use this in context, because in this case, even though you created the object using the context class, context object student that create method, the state is going to be detached. Detached means what? This object is not going to be tracked by this context object. It's just creating, you are just creating one object, but not tracking that object.
But
So
for
this,
instance, you could use it as a filter, while in the
right?
second case, you wouldn't be able to, right?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Case, in the first case, you could use it as a filter, for instance, while in the second case, you cannot use it at all.
Row in the sense, can you please elaborate what exactly it means? So this is the student object, right? This is, see, in this case, if you are getting confused, this is nothing but it's just a student object. And in this case, you can add the properties, right? You can also new student.
Okay, you're just using the context to create it, but you are not. Okay, I saw it. Sorry. Okay, thank you.
Understand now? So you are just creating one object, right? And in this case, you are using the context class students property and create method to create. And here you are directly creating the object using the new keyword, right? In both the cases, nothing is different, right? This student is going to be in data state because it is not tracked by the context object, and this object is also going to be in data state because it is not being tracked by the context object. Right now, if you run this application, then you will see that both of these statement going to give me the state as a detached. Right, so you can see detached. Right, and detached state means if you are calling the save changes method, right, then nothing is going to be happen. Clear, guys?
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you.
Right. Yes. So the next important method what we are going to discuss is the include method, right? Right. So in this case, if you go to student class, right, if you go to the student entity, right, then you will see that there is a property called student address. Now, what I want to do is, now while I'm including this data, right, while I'm loading the student ID, first name, last name, and standard ID, I also want to fetch the student address data, right? And for that, what you generally do in database is you want to show, this is one-to-one relationship. So you can go with a join, right? You can join the student table with the student address table, and then whatever column you want, you can retrieve. Yes or no? Right? From the, see, if you are having two database tables, right? So, okay, let me go. Right, if you want to fetch the data from the student and the student address table, then generally what syntax you write? So you are writing some select star from student, right? So what kind of join you want to use? I'm going with the inner join, right? And then student, let me give this as S, and the inner join I'm going with student address, right? SA on S dot student ID equals to SA dot student ID. And here I just want to fetch the S dot start. So this is the syntax you generally write, right? And if you want to fetch the student address, then you can write SA dot star also, right? Right. So you can generally use a join and paste the data, right? Now, that is what I want. While I'm loading the student data, and I also want to load the corresponding student address table data. For that purpose, I can go with the include method, right? So you can use the include method in two ways, right? What are the ways? You can go with the lambda expression, right? Or you can go with the name. So in this case, context.students.include. So while loading the student data, please include the student address table data also. It is the meaning of this is one, right? So you can go with this one or you can go with this one. Why I'm able to access this one? Because if you go to the student entity, then you will find one entity that is student address, right? If you go to the student entity, right, this is my student entity, there is one property student address, and that student address is returning me another entity called the student address, right? So in this case, you can access that properties like this. So you can specify the property using the lambda expression, or you can specify using the string name. So whichever option you like, you can go with that option. So in this case, what will happen? Now, in this case, the student, right, it is not only accessing, not only loading the student data, but also it is going to load the student address data. So in this case, what I'm trying to say is first name, last name, I'm checking the null operation, and I'm accessing the address 1 and the address 2 properties, right? Now run the application and you should see the data as expected, right? So you can see this is the first name, last name, lane 1, lane 2, and whatever new entities we have added, we have not specified the address, and the address you will not find here, right? So in this case, you can see the data are loaded as expected right now. Now you might be one question, sir, what is the big deal? I can also do the same thing without using the include statement. I can write the statement like this. Even I can also access the statement like this. This is also possible, and this statement is also going to give me the same output. So what is the big deal? So why I'm going to write that additional include statement? If I'm not writing that additional include statement, if I'm not specifying that table name, then still also I'm getting the output, right? To know the difference, what you need to do is you need to use the context dot transaction dot log, context dot database dot log equals to console dot write, right? So in this case, I have written this one and I have execute the code, right? So here you need to understand two things. So, right, this is my first select statement, which is returning me all the student table data, right? It is returning me all the student table data. Then suppose the student table content 10 student data, right? Then it is taking the student ID and making additional 10 select query to get the data from the student address table. This is another one select query. This is another select query, right? This is another select query. This is another select query. Then imagine if your table, right, contain 1000 data, then to get the corresponding, right, if your student table contains 1000 students, to get the corresponding student address, then how many number of a select query it is going to fire? For each student, one select query, fetch the data, another select query, fetch the another table data. That means the number of a round trip from the .NET application to the database is going to be how many number of times you can imagine, right? So instead of selecting this data, right, so what I can do is I can go with the include method, right? So if I'm going with the include method, no doubt about it, I'm going to get the output expected. But in this case, let's see how many select statement are there. How many select statement are there? Only one select statement, and in this case it is performing a join. So by doing this join operation, it can eliminate the number of round trips to be sent to the database to fetch the corresponding student data. So now you can imagine which query is going to give you better performance, whether it is the first approach where you are not using the include statement, or the one what I'm showing here, right? So in this case, what it is actually doing, it is using the eager loading concept. What do you mean by eager loading? What is lazy loading? That is what we are going to discuss later. But for now, I just need to give you eager loading means from the beginning only fetch all the data. Lazy loading means on demand. On demand means first fetch the student data, and whenever you want to fetch the student address data, at that time only it will make a call to the database and fetch the student address data. In this case, it will make the joining operation from the beginning and it is going to fetch the data, right? But guys, remember, in this case, my requirement is to include the student address, and my requirement is to use the student address. That's why I'm using, right? But for some scenario, you only want the student data. You are not interested with the student address. Then don't use the student address. Why? Because if you are using student address, then it is going to perform a joining operation, right? And in this case, let's assume I'm not interested with the student address, right? I'm just removing the student address, right? As I'm removing the student address, right? I'm removing the student address. I'm only interested with the student data, but I'm including this one, right? Even the student address is not required. No. Right? Even though student address is not required, it is also going to do the join, right? What kind of a join it is going to do? It is going to do the left join with the student address. This is not required. So if not required, then don't use this one, right? Now, if you remove this include method, right, then you will see that it is going to give the student data only, right? It is not going to load the student address data by doing other additional statement, right? Because in that case, you are not demanding the student address. If you are not demanding, then why Entity Framework is going to load the data? Because lazy loading means on demand. On demand by default, .NET by default Entity Framework uses the on demand or lazy loading, and this is the reason why you can see it is only making a select statement, right, with the corresponding database. And whenever you require the student address data, at that time only it is going to make it is going to load the student address data. But if you are going with this include syntax, what it means it is going to load the student as well as student address data at the same time. So based on your requirement, you need to decide which approach you need to follow. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Any question from anyone? Because see, this will improve your performance, right? Sometimes what they are your guys are doing, they are just following this syntax and accessing the student address like this. In that case, you can see how many number of select queries are issued used in your query, right? So how many number of select statements are generated by the entity framework, right? So you have to minimize the number of round trip with the database. If you are fetching and in a single SQL query, then why I'm going to use 100,000 SQL queries, right? That you need to decide. Again, if it is required, only then use the include, otherwise don't use, right? The objective is this one. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
There is another method called find method, right? And we already know what is the use of a find method, right? So in this case, right, in this case, what will happen? Okay, what is the DbSet.find method, right? So DbSet.find method means what? Now it is going to return the data based on the primary key value. So in this case, I'm using the find method to find the student whose ID is 3. Okay, let me check how many students are there and what is their ID value. So 1, 2, 3, 4, then 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, right? So in this case, 3, 6, 10, 3, 6, 10. So 1 and then 16. Okay, let me this make as 1, 16. Now 1, what is the next record? 12. 1, 12, and here I'm using 20, right? So now you just tell me, okay, this find method. So this 3, it is nothing but the primary key of this entity, student entity, primary key. What is that you need to pass to this find method? So 3, 12, and 20. 3 is there in this table? Yes, 3 is there, right? 12 is there in this table? Yes, 12 is there in this table. 20 is there in this table? No, 20 is not there in this table. But this find method, what exactly it is going to do, right? Whenever you use the find method, first it will check the context object, whether that in context object, and whether that entity whose ID you are passing as a parameter to this parameter is available in the context object or not. If available, then it simply return the data from the cache, right? From the beginning, I have told you one of the advantages of using entity framework is caching, right? First level of caching is provided by the context object. If you are fetching one record by using the find method, if that ID, right, whatever the primary key you are providing or whatever the entity you are searching for, if that entity is available in the context object, then it will not make a select query. It will not go to the database and fetch the data, right? If it is not available in the context object, then only it is going to the database and fetch the data, right? So that is the use of a find method. So first of all, it will look at the context object. If available, it will simply return from the context object. And if it is not available in the context object, then it will go to the database and fetch the data from the database, right? If it is not available in the database, then that is other thing, right? So in this case, my context object session is created here, and here I'm fetching the data. So what data I'm fetching? I'm fetching, right, all the student whose ID is less than equals to 5. So in this case, this 4 student information, it is going to store inside this context object, So in this case, it is fetching the student whose ID is less than equals to 5. That means student ID 1, 2, 3, 4 is going to be fetched and stored in the context object, right? And that is what I'm printing here. Then I'm issuing one, then later my requirement come, yes, can you please find the student whose ID is 3? Yes, I can do this by using the find method. So I'm using your find method and providing the ID 3. So in this case, first of all, it will check the student context object. Inside the context object, you have already make a select statement which return me the first 4 record, 1, 2, 3, 4. And from this context object, is there any student whose ID is 3 is there? Yes, is there. So in this case, it will return the data from the context object. It will not go to the database. Now, I'm issuing another request. Now my requirement is there. Please find the student whose ID is 12. So first it will check the context object. In the context object, is this record 12 is there? Right?
No.
So is this record 12 is there?
No.
No. So if the record 12 is not there, right? Then what it will do? It will go to the database, right? It will go to the database and fetch the data. Again, I'm searching for the 12. Now it will fetch the data, means the data is stored in the context. Again, if I'm issuing the same query, it will return me the data from the context. Now I'm searching for 20. Is the 20 is available in the context object? No, it is not available. So it will go to the database and it will check whether 20 is available in the database or not. No, 20 is not available. So in that case, it will not return any data, right? Now, if you run the application, right? Okay, let me stop this one. I need to put it at the transaction logger, right? Context dot database dot log equals to console dot write, right? Now, right? So how many number of a select query? First, it will fetch all the data from the database. Yes. Where student ID is less than equals to 5. Guys.
Yes.
Yes.
So this is the first SQL statement is generated for this one, right? Then do we have any SQL statement for finding the student whose ID is 3? Is there any SQL statement to find the record whose ID is 3, right? Next select statement is for ID value what?
12.
12. So 12 means it is searching for this one, not for this one. It is not generating any SQL statement for this one. Why? So in this case, it is fetching the data. It is fetching the data from the context object only, right? And if it is fetching the data context object from the context object from the cache memory, then why it should generate the select statement and go to the database, right? This is nothing but your caching, right? And then it is searching for 12. And how many times we use the 12? 2 times. Do we have 2 SQL select statement for the value 12 or only one?
Only one.
One. Why?
Only one.
Why second time it is not fetching the data? Because the data already in the context object. Na? If the data is already in the context object, it is not going to fetch the data again from the database. And last one is 20. 20 is not in the context object, so it is going to fetch the data from the database, right? It will issue a select statement. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Okay.
Right? So this is wow, right? This is how your the find method is going to work. Clear?
Yes. One question. Like, can
Yes.
you go into code?
Yes, yes, sure.
So, like, when we are running this program, right? So at the end, like, so for an example, on line number 28, we are trying to fetch the data where the ID is 12, right? But for an example, 2 user is working on the same database, like we are fetching data, and at the same time, like if another user deleted the data from the database, then what will happen?
Right. So in this case, it is going to work on in memory, right? So once you
Yes.
fetch the data, right? And later if the data, say this is the issue, This is the issue in the sense. So you know there is some concept called concurrency, right?
Yes.
You know what is concurrency?
No, actually, I
Right.
attended from.
Right. So basically there is some concept called a transaction. Transaction means once a transaction started and once the transaction access some data, right, then it will acquire a lock on that data. And and once the transaction is not completed, right, in between the time you cannot modify or you cannot view or you cannot delete the intermediate state of the entity, right? So you have to understand that concept concurrency in SQL Server, right? Once
Okay.
you understand the concurrency concept, then you will understand these things, right? But in this case, it is not that issue, it is not that problem, right? Once you paste the data from the database, right, then it is in memory. In memory, the data is there. If you delete the data in the database, that will not affect the in memory data, right? Right. So, and in that case, it is going to check. And in that case, if you want to make sure, then always you do not need to store the data in memory. Always you need to go to the database.
Okay.
Right? And why we are using here? We want to improve the application performance. So if you want to increase the application performance, then you should not use the concept called caching. Sorry, if you are updating the data or modifying the data each and every time, then caching should not be there. Why? When we are used to when we are going to use the caching is basically used when you want to store some master data, right? Master data means the data which is not going to be changed that frequently, right? Master, so for example, country master, right, city master, right, those data are not going to change that frequently, right? So you
Yes.
need to store those data in the database. But some product table is there, right? You know that product table is there, that price is going to be changed frequently, right? That quantity is going to be updated frequently. Then in that case, you should not store those data into the cache.
Okay, so here one problem. So for an example, when we are depositing any amount in bank, but it is not reflecting same time onto the application. So maybe like the
See,
application.
in the case, in the case of bank application, do you think that you are going to fetch all the data or any particular student entity?
Any particular.
So in that case, do not need to. It's not required to store that data in the database. Whenever required, you need to get the data from the database.
Yeah,
And
yes, because we are facing only
one
one
more
data.
thing, when you are implementing that banking application, right, your application code should not be like this. You have to write the transaction, right? You know, in our edu.net, right, even though in Entity Framework we are going to discuss, right, we are going to implement the transaction. As part of the transaction, we are going to do the operation, right? Once we start the transaction, right, once we paste the data from the database, then the same data cannot be modified by any other user.
Okay.
Right? Understand?
Yeah. Yes.
All right. So we'll discuss that transaction concept. We are going to also discuss, right? But guys, I would suggest please go and yes, transaction is one of the important concept. Transaction, deadlock, right? Concurrency problem. Please try to learn from SQL Server point of view, right? So is that
Yes.
clear? Yes.
Yes,
When we
clear.
are going to use caching concept means whenever that is not a transactional data, right? So transactional data means what? The data which is going to be updated frequently. And whenever you are having some master data, then you can store those master data in a cache, right? Clear, guys?
Yes.
Yeah,
Right.
makes sense.
Next, what we are going to discuss, we are going to discuss the remove method. We have already discussed this remove method, right, which is provided by the DbSet class, right? So what I'm going to do, I'm just going fetching the employee, right? I'm fetching the employee whose ID is 10, right? Let me give this value as 10. I'm fetching the student. Sorry, I'm saying employee. I'm fetching the student, right, whose ID is 10, right? I'm fetching this student data, right? I'm using the faster default method. If you are not interested with this faster default method, you can go with the find method. That's fine, right? So once you fetch the student data, right, before delete, right, what should be the state? It should be unchanged. And I'm checking whether that student entity is exist or not. If exist, then I'm removing the student, right? Once I remove the student, so at this point, the state is going to be deleted, but the data is not deleted from the database. At this point, the entity state is deleted, but it is not deleted from the database, right? And when we call the save changes method, right, that entity is going to be deleted from the database. And once that entity is deleted, the state is changed to detached, right? Detached means the context is no longer going to track that entity, right? Let me run this application. Right, so initially unchanged. When we call the remove method, it is deleted. When we call the save changes method, it is detached. We have already discussed this remove method, so no need to explain this method again and again. Clear?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Right, so another important method which is provided by the context class is remove range method. So in this case, what is my requirement? Now I want to remove all the, so in this case you can see that employee that student ID 10 will be removed. Right now I want to remove all this data, right? I want to bring the data into the initial position, right? So I want to remove all the data where student ID is greater than 10, right? So student ID greater than 4. So in this case, first of all, I'm fetching the list of students, and all the student state will be in this case unchanged, right? So before remove range method, by default, the student state, it is going to be unchanged. And then I'm checking whether this list of student is not equals to null, and at least one student is there, right? If at least one student is there, then I'm going to remove that student. But in this case, it might be possible that there is one student or more than one student. So you cannot use the remove method. So in this case, I'm going to use the remove range method, and to this remove range method I'm passing this collection, right? Once you call this remove range method, then the state is going to be deleted for all these entities which is written by this select statement, right? And when I'm calling the save changes method, then all those entities are going to be deleted from the database, and after delete, the state is going to be what? Detached, right? So in this case, let me also print the transaction database.log, and let me store that inside the console class, console window, by using the right? So let me run this application. Right, so in this case you can see, so first of all it used the select statement to fetch the data. How many records are there? It is fetching 5 records, because greater than 4 means this 5 record is returned. So initially the state is unchanged, right? Unchanged state at this time. When you call the remove method and when you try to print the state, then it is going to be deleted, right? And once it is deleted, then I'm calling the save changes method. Then what will happen? So you can see how many number of a delete statement it is going to use. So for each record, right, it is going to use a single delete statement, right? And once the deletes are done, then the state is going to be removed, or it's going to be changed to detached, right? So what people are doing mistake in real-time application while using entity framework, they suppose they want to add a collection, so they are going with the add range method, and then and when they are going to remove a collection, right, remove multiple entities, they are using the remove range. But behind the scene, what happens? Now it is going to use delete statement, single delete statement for single record. If your collection contain 1,000 records, 1,000 time it is issuing the delete statement to the database, or 1,000 time it is issuing the insert statement to the database, right? That means if the number of a round trip to the database is going to be more, then that means what? That means the performance is going to be less, right? So if you are going to perform bulk operation, right, then don't use this remove and add range method. Yes, 5 record, 10 record, 20 record, 50 record, that is fine. If you are performing the addition for 1,000 records, 500 records, 100 records, right, then at that time don't use this remove range or add range method. Up to 10, that is fine. But if the number of a record or the number of an entity is more, then you should find another way of bulk insert and update operation or bulk delete operation. That is what we are going to discuss, right? So, but for now, that is fine. Remove range is there, add range is there. Clear? Guys?
Yes.
Right, but this is, see, people, so why I'm saying this, if you are working with an existing project, right, if the person or the developer who doesn't have any detailed experience, and if he simply using the add range method or remove range method, but if he doesn't know that how exactly the add range or remove range method are working internally, right, then he simply use and he simply think that yes, I'm using add range method means multiple records are going to be inserted into the database. That is fine. But how they are going to be inserted or how they are going to be removed, they do not. And in that case, if you verify the SQL statement, right? If I'm executing one save changes method means it is definitely going to generate some insert, update, and delete statement. How these statements are generated, whether they are using at a single request, it is sending all the data to the database, or for each entity, it is creating a separate SQL statement. This is what you need to understand, right? And once you understand this thing, then you will find, yes, this is definitely not the good programming practice. This is definitely not good when I'm going to insert 1,000 records, 100 records to the database. Then I need to find some other approach where I can improve the application performance. And that is what we are also going to discuss in our sessions. Clear, guys? Clear?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. And see, in edu.net, right, if someone, right, if someone is not interested, if someone having good experience with SQL server, right, and if he do not want to use this kind of things, right, student where all these things, right, if he is interested to write the plain SQL statement, right, then that is also possible, right? That is also possible using our context class. What you need to do, you need to use the SQL query method, right? And in that case, the way we are writing the command, right, using the command object, the same way we can also write our query, right? So context.student.sql query. From this student entity, please return me this data. I don't know how to use that where method, how to use that lambda expression, but I know these things. If you know this thing, then also it is possible in Entity Framework. But you should not use these things because this is completely bind with the database, right? The statement what I'm using here, right? It might be not executed in MySQL. It might be not executed in your Oracle database server, right? So in this case, he is expecting one select statement. The syntactically whether it is true or false, he doesn't know, right? He will take the SQL statement and will try to execute on the database. If he executed successfully, fine. If not executed, he is not going to take the responsibility because as a developer we are writing the code, right? So in this case you can also write the plain SQL query, and in this case, right, if you want to fetch the list of students to remove, don't write the remove, first fetch the, okay, this is the uh, comment is mismatching, right? In this statement I want to fetch the student whose ID is 2, right? In that case you can use this option, but while using this option you need to specify on which kind of data it is going to return. You want to, and in this SQL query it is consisting of two parts. First part you have to specify the query, and the second part you have to specify the entity, means which kind of data it is going to return and in which kind of variable I'm going to store that result. I want to store the result inside the student type, so you have to specify that type here, right? And in this case, if you do not want to track the result of SQL query, then what you need to use? You need to use the as no tracking option, right? Here it is tracking SQL query, and here it is not tracking the SQL query result. So in this case, the state of the entity is going to be unchanged, and in this case, the state of the entity it is going to be detached, right? So using this SQL query method, right, you can also write the TSQL statement, right? So in this case, this is going to be your TSQL statement by using the SQL query method. Clear, guys?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, so like for example, we have two options like we can use that entity framework or we can use ADO.NET. So what do we need to choose first?
So first of all, I just from the day one, I'm saying Entity Framework will ADO.NET will give you better performance than Entity Framework. Then you just tell me if I want to execute this SQL statement, then which approach I should follow?
ADO.NET.
You are giving the answer.
Okay, but you said on the first day also you said there is a performance difference, but it's just like a 8, 19, 20 kind of performance rate. So like
Right.
ADO.NET is
Definitely,
there's a
ADO.NET is going to give 19 and if one task is going to be taken by 95 seconds, then Entity Framework will going to take 100 seconds,
then
right?
there is a no huge difference, right?
No, there is if huge difference is there, then why people are going to use Entity Framework, right? So if you want to execute plain SQL statement, then it's better to use ADO.NET. Entity Framework means what? Entity Framework should do the things behind the scene, right? See, in this case, if this SQL statement is executed, right? Suppose I'm writing here, selected top, right? Suppose I'm writing this top 1 star, right? Right here I'm using top 1 star from the student, right? So this syntax is going to be executed on SQL server, but if you take this syntax and try to execute on MySQL, is it going to run or work?
No.
No, because the syntax of fetching the top record is different in MySQL, it's different in a SQL server, right? So it is not going to work in all the databases. But if you write the syntax, right, using the entities, using the where clause, find method, right, then those are not going to give you this kind of a problem, right? Based on the corresponding database, they will generate the appropriate SQL statement. So in this case, we are writing the SQL statement. In this case, Entity Framework is not going to generate the SQL statement. Clear?
Okay,
But
but
yes,
if we are using different two different kind of database, then we need to use a different object, right? Like for an example, instead of SQL queries, we need to like write MySQL query.
no,
And
yes, exactly. You have to write MySQL code, right? So, but if you are so today you have written this statement pointing to SQL Server database, it is going to work fine. Tomorrow you have migrated from SQL Server to MySQL. Your code is not going to work. You have to come and change wherever you use this in SQL syntaxes, right? But instead of this, right? Instead of this, what you have written the syntax, right? Right? You have written this syntax. You have written this syntax, right? Then this syntax today your database pointing to SQL Server, it is going to generate the SQL statement targeting the SQL Server database. Tomorrow you have migrated from SQL Server to MySQL. This code is not going to be changed.
okay, we need to change. We need to do change in the string connection, I guess.
Exactly. You have to change
Because at the time of this creation of this project, we have mentioned like we are going to fetch data from SQL Server,
you have to change the EDMX file.
DbMX file. Okay.
Right? And in EDMX file, you have to specify an EDMX file accordingly. See, EDMX file is going to generate this classes all the same thing, right? If
Yes.
you are migrating from one database to another database means the table structure is not going to be changed, right? Here the table name is whatever the table name you have provided there, you also need to provide the same table name. It should not be the different table name. Table name is going to be same, right? But the way you are writing the code, the way you are writing the SQL syntax, that is what going to be changed. And in this case, that is what going to be taken care by the entity framework. So in this case, today you are targeting to SQL Server. It is going to generate SQL specific to SQL Server database. Tomorrow you migrated from SQL Server to Oracle. You do not need to come to this main method of this program class and do any changes inside this. You just need to update the entity framework. Rest of the things is going to be taken care by this entity framework. Now the database is MySQL, so it is going to generate the SQL query, which is going to be executed by the MySQL database.
Yes, got it.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you are trying to execute some TSQL statement, then why should you use this entity framework?
Yes.
Right? You should go with ADO.NET. Entity framework means we should not write any TSQL statement, and this is the reason why we are going with the entity framework. We are not going to create the command object, create the connection object, right? Use the SQL data reader or execute scalar, non-query, all these things. We don't want those things, and this is the reason why we are going with the entity framework.
Okay, so with the entity framework, we can perform any kind of like a complex, simple, every kind of like a operation.
Everything, right?
Okay.
That is what, see, there is a specific chapter for this is LinQ, right?
Okay.
Language integrated query, right? Whenever you are working with the LinQ means entity framework should be there. And using this LinQ, right? You are having student table, you are having student address table, another table, 2 table, 4 table, 5 table, no matter. You can perform inner join, you can perform left outer join in the you can write the syntax using the LinQ query in such a way that the entity framework is going to generate the TSQL statement accordingly, right? So everything we are going to cover.
Okay,
But
then this is very powerful.
yes, very powerful. This is the reason why most of the companies are using this thing. Nah? So they don't want to be depend on the database because no matter. So who knows? Today I'm going to use a SQL server. Might be possible that tomorrow I'm going to use a SQL server database, right? And if I'm writing the storage procedure, then imagine how much time it will take effect, right? If you are
Yes.
creating one storage procedure in SQL server, the same storage procedure copy paste into MySQL and check whether that is going to be executed or not. It is never going to be work,
Yes.
right? So because of that, we should not depend on the database, right? Database is there only to store the data. And the logic, right? How we are going to paste the data, how we are going to insert, doing the insert update, all these things, right? is going to be taken care by the entity framework,
Nice.
right?
Okay, but
Yes.
well, with according to your experience, right? I mean, is it realistic that you're gonna move one application from one server to a different one?
Yes.
Because
So in my current the project, right, which I'm working for, it should not be disposed, but I'm saying you, right, there is a State Bank in India, right, and people might be know about State Bank, right, and currently we are managing the loyalty program for the State Bank. Before 5 years, right, when I have started at that time, the database is SQL Server, right? But from the last 3 years, we have migrated from SQL Server to MySQL. Because MySQL SQL Server is more cost effective, right? If you want to buy the server, buy the some SQL Server database server, right? It is going to more costly than MySQL. So because of that reason, management decided to move from SQL Server to MySQL. Right.
Yeah.
okay.
And second thing, if you do not have much more experience into SQL Server, right, then you can work with the entity framework and the storage procedure. You do not need to create. You do not need to create any SQL join all these things, right? You have to use the .NET syntax and entity framework will going to generate those things behind the scene.
Okay,
You
so
would
like
work with the model first, right? You work with the model first, and the entity framework does everything. But if you work with the database first,
Database first in the
you,
sense what? Database first in the sense your
but
database
you
is
should
ready.
have the store procedures already if you want to work database first, right? Or not? No?
No,
No?
database first means what? Yes, if you are creating some storage procedure, and if you want to reuse that storage procedure, then you can go. Even the if your database, see, database first means what? Your database is ready. Database is ready means you have created the tables, you have created the views, you have stored the data in the database, right? In that case, you need to use database first, and it might be possible that some of the storage procedure is there, some of the function is there, and if you want to reuse those functions, you can reuse. If you don't want to reuse, don't reuse. See, as of now, whatever insert, update, delete operation we have done so far, am I using any kind of storage procedure?
No. Or no.
That means without storage procedure, without table value function, is it possible to perform the operations or not on the database?
Oh, yes, you can.
Yes. If storage procedure is there, if you are having a very big storage procedure, which is having 1,000 line of code, right? then you can, why you are going to use that inside this? So I can directly use that storage procedure. I can call that storage procedure for my from my application, right? Right. Sometimes what happens now, some of the things which you cannot manage, right? Some of the things you cannot manage from your what I can say from the application point of view, right? Some trigger you need to maintain some auditable data, right? For that purpose, you can use the database trigger. Trigger is there, right? Whenever you are doing some any kind of modification, changes, all these things, then, you can maintain those things in the audit table, right? So database is as it is, and entity framework is also there. So code first approach means what? Now based on your code, the database is going to be created, right? Whatever the table you want inside the database, you do not need to create those table, right? In the database side, you have to write the code in your entity model, right? Based on the entity model, the table is going to be generated in the database, right? And then once the table is generated, once the database is created, then if you, it doesn't matter whether you are using the code first approach or model first approach. Once the database table, all these things is created, you can create storage procedure, right?
Okay.
Right. So once you do practices, right? Once we start discussing the model first approach, then you will understand the difference between what is this. Sorry, once you start discussing the code first approach, then you will understand what is the difference between the database first approach and that the code first approach. Because as of now, we have not touched that code first approach, right? So we will discuss those things again in detail. As of now, we are keep focusing on the database first approach. Once this is completed, then I will show you the difference between code first approach and the database first approach and how you can work with the code first approach. Right?
Okay. Okay. Good. Excellent.
Any question from anyone? That's it for today.
No question, sir.
Right. And guys, please attend the sessions regularly. And why I'm saying, because many things which are explained in the class, right, are not available in the document, right? Because
Yeah.
I want to cover more and more things, right? So that context dot transaction dot log, right? These things are not available in the document, right? And whatever I'm explaining you, yes, for this delete statement, right? For this remove method, remove range method, it is creating this number of delete statement, right? These things are not available in the document, right? If you attend the session, then only you will understand these things, right? So because in a single day, it's very difficult for me to prepare 30 pages of a documentation, 40 pages of a documentation, right? So very difficult for me, right? But everything, whatever document is possible, definitely I will prepare. But all these things I'm going to explain in the classroom. So this is the reason why I'm requesting everyone, please attend the sessions. And if not attending, then don't only go through the documents, right? Please watch the videos completely from the starting to end. Okay.
Yes.
So any question from anyone?
Mm.
Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Have a good
you.
day.
Bye.